children very rarely lie about sexual abuse.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. When it comes to understanding the terrible adversities that some kids face, like sibling sexual abuse, it is important to separate the facts from the hyperbole and the anecdotes that get used to generate fear or to gain attention. Trusted and proven sources of information are critical. And there is no more trusted source for this topic than the Sibling Aggression and Abuse Research and Advocacy Initiative, or SAARA, at the Crimes Against Children Research Center, a center that has been studying family violence and related topics since 1975. My guest today to share information and resources about sibling sexual abuse is Tanya Whitworth, a research scientist at SAARA and a generous guest and advocate. Talking About Kids is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. Serious researchers like Tanya do not come on this podcast to meet me. They come on to share information that benefits kids. You can do your part by sharing this series with your friends and your professional network. And now, the interview.
Going all the way back to graduate school, I've always been interested in sexual health of children and young people and preventing victimization of various types. And as I explored the literature, I realized that there's a really big gap around siblings. So there's a lot around preventing child sexual abuse from adults. There's a lot around preventing sexual violence in at all ages, but in for example, teen dating relationships, and really siblings is until recently. This is fortunately changing a little bit, but until recently, um, the fact that siblings could sexually harm each other wasn't really on the radar. And so I I got this opportunity to work for this grant-funded initiative called the Sibling Aggression and Abuse Research and Advocacy Initiative, and it made sense for me to really focus in on sexual behavior and sexual abuse between siblings.
And I want to talk about that because I think that one of the things that's pretty apparent from the literature is this repetition of why aren't we talking about it? And there's a lot of articles that have tried to unpack that. Why has this been understudied, underdiscussed? Why do we know so little about it? But I think I need to get a good definition of what we mean when we say sibling sexual abuse.
Absolutely. So it's important to understand that sexual behavior develops across childhood and adolescence, and that is a perfectly normal and appropriate part of development, including possibly some behaviors between siblings. And so sibling sexual behavior really exists on a continuum from developmentally appropriate. So that could be something like pretty young children, preschoolers, toddlers, uh, you know, looking at each other undressed, for example, being curious about each other's bodies. So, developmentally appropriate, all the way to potentially abusive. There's a big range of behaviors. And so, when when asking if something might be abusive, I think you have to consider several factors. One is the behavior. So, anytime you see advanced sexual behaviors, anytime, and that could be, fondling,
Mm.
oral genital contact, intercourse, anything like that would be concerning really at any age between siblings. A lot of non-contact behaviors could also be concerning. Like for example, uh, showing a sibling pornography who is not of an age where they should be seeing that could
Okay.
potentially um, be abusive. And then you also need to look at the motivation of the child who is potentially causing harm. So, are they being motivated by an age appropriate curiosity? Or is it something that is a compulsion, a peer
Mm.
pressure situation, something, some other sort of non typical motivation? And then impact.
Mm.
So that's really the most important thing. And that can make it, it means that it's situation dependent, but the child who you suspect has been harmed, are they showing any signs of trauma, of fear of their sibling? The normal signs that you would look for child sexual abuse, like changes in behavior, withdrawing, maybe sleep troubles, maybe stomach aches or headaches, right? So, you kind of have to look at all of these different factors.
In doing just a little bit of preparation for this, because as I mentioned, this is not something that gets talked about a lot, and it's definitely not something that I was trained in when I was studying. Wasn't part of any curriculum that I was given. So there's a couple things that seem to make sibling sexual abuse particularly difficult. One of them seems to be this notion of what consent means between siblings. Can you explain that a little bit, please?
Sure. Well, I'll say I struggle with the word consent
Okay.
because I've been assuming, I've been speaking about minor siblings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so consent is kind of a tricky topic with
Mm-hmm.
minors. I tend to think in terms of how mutual is the behavior.
Right.
So mutuality versus consent. And that is still tricky, to be honest, to determine. And so some people historically have used an age gap. And even now, some people will use an age gap between the siblings as kind of a proxy for whether it's developmentally appropriate or possibly abusive. So they'll say, well, if it's a 5 year gap or a 4 year gap, then it's a problem. But if it's less, it's not. I think it's more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
The research is pretty clear that speaking to survivors, that a sizable minority were harmed by a sibling who was close in age to them. So then it's, what do you look for? A power differential.
Mm.
So there is some one-sidedness to the relationship where one sibling has more power to control what happens than the other. And that could be based on a lot of different factors. It might be age, it might be gender, it might be um, parental favoritism, right? And mutuality, I'll just say it's also complicated for the child who's being harmed. They can often be very confused about it themselves because sometimes it starts out as developmentally appropriate exploration. You show me mine, or
Right.
you show me yours, I'll show you mine, right? And then one child wants to continue and sort of uses very, either subtle or more explicit
Right.
threats of telling parents or something to continue. And now the child who's being harmed feels like because they initially participated that they have to keep going along with it.
What do we know about how prevalent this is? Like when you say we should be looking for, these signs that are kind of common with abuse victims, but also victims of bullying, victims of abuse outside of the home. So a lot of those warning signs that you mentioned are shared. So, like, how prevalent is this? As just to give us a sense of how closely we should be looking for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one takeaway is just I don't want parents to be paranoid about
Mm-hmm.
this, but I do want it to be on their radar. So when you are considering these warning signs, I think siblings should be at least on the list
Mm-hmm.
of, relationships and dynamics to consider. How common is it? So our data is improving on this all the time. Until recently, we really didn't know. A recent meta-analysis was published that put the percentage at between 1 and 7% of children. Now, from my own research and reading of the literature, my best guess is around 2%.
Okay.
A recent Australian child maltreatment study found 1.6% as their estimate. And so I think around 2%, maybe as high as 7% of children, which is, it's certainly not as high as the percentage of children that experience, for example, physical
Mm-hmm.
victimization from a sibling, but that's still a lot of children.
Well, and the importance of that, I think we need to get into because so even though it's a smaller percentage, there are particular impacts that sibling sexual abuse has. And let's go over that a little bit. You mentioned kind of the short term impacts, how it's changing behaviors um, after or while it's going on, or after it's happening in the short term. But what are some of the long term impacts on survivors of sibling sexual abuse?
Sibling sexual abuse has been linked to a host of impacts in the literature pretty robustly. Mental health, certainly depression, anxiety, PTSD, there's a heightened risk for all of those. And then also relationship health, which is
Mm,
really, sort of central to your functioning over your whole life course. And so survivors of sibling sexual abuse often, not always, of course, right, but often have trouble forming romantic and intimate relationships. They often have trouble trusting others. It's hard when you're one of your earliest peers and someone who was supposed to be in your family and you were supposed to be able to trust them, and that's how they treated you. Like
mm,
shapes it ends up shaping your outlook for the rest of your life. Often we hear a lot at SAARA, um, from survivors of all forms of sibling abuse, but including sexual, who are often in their 50s or 60s, and they tell us about how they still struggle. They have, intrusive memories, they have mental health um, difficulties, they have, trouble with relationships and intimacy. And so I do think it can be quite serious.
Yeah. Well, and I also have to imagine like what it does with the relationship with the parents too, the primary care providers, because I have to imagine that the victims are thinking, why aren't these people protecting me? And that must really compromise their attachment.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not a clinician myself, I'm a researcher, but when we speak to clinicians, they often say that sibling abuse should be considered complex trauma
Mm,
because it often occurs over a period of time during childhood when attachment relationships are forming. And so there's the trauma in the sibling attachment relationship, but then there's also the trauma in the parent or the caregiver attachment relationship. And many survivors describe the their parents' failure to respond as a secondary victimization
yeah,
or even as a worse victimization
yeah.
than the sexual abuse itself.
I mean, because, just what we know about attachment, it's the difference between not being safe and not knowing how to be safe, right? And that is such a big mental shift for a young child. It's one thing to experience pain and danger. It's another to not know how to make it stop because your primary care providers aren't doing that for you. So I totally understand that. And by the way, listeners of Talking About Kids know that we just had Deb Pepler on, who talked a lot about the importance of attachment. So this is if you want a reminder of why we are talking about that now, you can go back and listen to those episodes. Um, Part of me wants to ask if what the impact of modern family structures is doing to sibling sexual abuse. But Tanya, I have to be really honest with you. When even how I crafted those words there, um, there's part of me, and I have to imagine that some of my listeners are feeling this way, that it could be that the different structures that we have in families now create more opportunities for abuse to happen. But I'm afraid to talk about it because I don't want to ever come across as blaming these situations, or even making people who are in those situations unduly worried about this. So maybe you can tell me that I'm just wrong, that there is nothing about blended families, that there is nothing about extended families, that puts them at greater risk. That would be wonderful to hear. But if that's not the case, tell me what we know about that.
So this is where I step out of my comfort zone because
Okay.
the research gets a little sparse.
Mm.
We d- um the research on, for example, step families
Mm-hmm.
is not conclusive, but it does seem like step siblings might be a little bit more likely to sexually harm um, each other than, biological siblings. However, I would like to inject some hope
Mm-hmm.
because I also think that people have more ability to leave um, unhealthy or unhappy marriages and partnerships now than they ever have before. And, we haven't spoken about this yet, but abuse in the family system and family stress and child maltreatment
Mm-hmm.
are all things that increase the risk of sibling sexual abuse. So if, part of the increase in blended families is an increase in people being able to dissolve unions that are unhealthy or
Mm-hmm.
abusive,
Mm-hmm.
and form newer, healthier ones, then that would actually be, that could potentially go in the opposite direction. So I think it's a mixed situation. It does seem like children who live together and spend more of their childhood together, may be less likely to sexually abuse each other. So that's also a factor that it might be related to step
Okay.
families, but might not be.
Well, part of your response there implies that something that I guess I should have been aware of, or I guess I know, but that is so. I'm assuming then that in households where any sort of abuse is present and tolerated, and in households where coercion is practiced between anybody in the house, between the adults, the primary care providers, or other people, wherever in households where that is tolerated, am I right then in assuming that we see greater incidents of sibling sexual abuse?
Yes,
Okay.
definitely. So there are certainly individual level factors at the child level that can predict sibling sexual abuse, but I think the family level predictors are stronger.
Okay.
So, as I said, any sort of abuse or coercion, as you said, in the family system, whether it is domestic violence between parents, any sort of child maltreatment. So that could be, physical or sexual abuse, psychological abuse, neglect from caregivers to the children. Um, Families that have a lot of stress or
Mm-hmm.
face a lot of adversities, things like parental affairs, job loss, any sort of things that put stress on the family, all of those can increase the risk of sibling sexual abuse happening.
Well, it's also the case that those things also cut both ways because when you are talking about the warning signs, and again, this is something that comes up over and over again in this podcast, and that is in order to be able to recognize that a kid in your life is experiencing something harmful, detrimental, you have to know them and be present to them in order to see the shifts in their behaviors, right? So it seems like over and over again it comes back to we need parents to be present. We need adults to be present in the lives of the kids so that they know what baseline is. They know when there are these changes because some of them, of course, are pretty subtle shifts in these behaviors. And so again, be present. That's I'm gonna not even. I can get on a soapbox about that, Tanya, but I'll leave it at that. Are there any other risk factors that you want to point out to the listeners?
Yeah, so to kind of restate what you just said, um, and I will say also, it's not just parents, but any adult,
Right.
having the presence of one adult in a child's life, I'm sure you've heard this before, who
Mm-hmm.
is truly invested in them and paying attention to them and cares about them makes a huge difference for resilience. So even if they are facing some sort of abuse or maltreatment at home, this could be a teacher or a mentor, any sort of trusted adult, an extended family member, having someone who is paying attention. But as in terms of other risk factors, so definitely lack of supervision, and that could be parents who are either physically absent or emotionally absent
Right.
or both. Uh, as I mentioned before, like a power differential or a hierarchy between the sibling. So and some of those parents do have control over. So differential treatment, for example, or
Mm-hmm.
most people just call it favoritism, can be really um, kind of poisonous to the sibling relationship. And also putting, and this one's tough too. This is one that I have trouble with, but putting one sibling in a caregiver role for another sibling really creates a situation where abuse can happen more
Mm,
easily. I kind of, I always worry about saying that because we have to recognize that some families don't have a choice.
right.
So, the only person that they can afford to have watch their younger child, or, that they can find, is a sibling. And in some cultures, there's also a lot more emphasis on sibling caregiving as being very normative. But we do know that's a risk factor. And then, just a few more. So, boys are a lot more likely than girls to sexually harm a sibling. It's around 80 to 90%
Okay.
boys. And also children who um, experience social isolation, bullying, sometimes certain disabilities that lower inhibition or um, make it more difficult for that child or adolescent to understand social cues can
Okay.
also be linked. So there are some individual level factors too. And, you know, one thing that I do always like to say is it's really easy to blame parents,
Mm,
but parents don't always know.
yeah.
And, even if parents don't always have the information. So I hope this podcast can help parents to have the information that they need. So even if they do know something's going on, they might not realize. Um, yeah.
Well, so yeah, I don't want any parent or caregiver or to feel guilty about needing to have a job, needing to have alternative childcare in place. We on talking about kids, we believe that childcare should be universal because the data says that it should be. But I do think that I do emphasize a lot, Tanya, that we do need to be present to our children. We need to listen to them. We need to know who they are so that we can recognize these shifts in behaviors. And what I'm hoping to do when I say that in this context is I not make parents afraid that if they're not more present that this is going to happen to their child, but really to recognize that being present has a ton of benefits, including the fact that you will be more likely to recognize if your child is experiencing this kind of abuse. So it not only makes your child, helps them adapt, socially, makes them more resilient, better students, all that great stuff. But it also helps you detect when things are wrong going on with them. Um, I have to imagine, and this might seem like a pretty obvious question, Tanya, but what should parents do when they suspect that a kid in their life, and we're going to extend this too, like what should teachers, what should direct service providers do if they suspect that there's a kid in their life that is experiencing sibling sexual abuse?
I'm really glad you asked that question. The number one thing is believe the child. So children very rarely lie about sexual abuse. So
Mm,
I think number one is try to believe them and be empathetic and listen. I would say don't cross examine them or try to
mm,
get details of every single thing that happened. Although, especially if you're the parent, that might be a reaction because you might be shocked and
right.
you want to, get as much information as you can. But I would say start with being empathetic, listening, and believing. Tell the child that this shouldn't have happened to them
Mm,
and that you're going to support them to get help. And again, this is really tough for parents, especially if the sibling is also their child, right? Which
Right.
is usually the case. So to think that one of your children has seriously sexually harmed one of your children, many parents' initial reaction is going to be shock. It might be disbelief. It might be, um, and if you do have an initial reaction that isn't perfect, I think go back and say, I'm sorry, I was so shocked at first,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not happy with how I responded. Like, let's try again. And then, yeah, I think follow through with trying to get some therapeutic and professional help, and check on the child who caused harm too, because
Right.
there's often something going on with them too, and they will greatly benefit as well from therapeutic help.
Exactly. I'm so glad you said that last part too, because I think that you're right. The initial reactions, and by the way, this is very, very parallel to what we talk about when it comes to bullying. That we tend to do things like ask what happened, and the kid doesn't want might not want to say what happened right then. Right? They just want you to believe them and to let them know that it's going to stop. Um, but I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tanya, but what you just said, the fact that the perpetrators in these incidents, they are behaving in a way that is not successful for them. This is not something that the lack of empathy, the lack of control, the lack of the understanding of social cues, all of the things that contribute to a perpetrator abusing a sibling are things that need to be addressed. What the child is doing is that they are trying to get their own needs met, but in a way that is not going to work for them in the long term. Am I correct in assuming that?
Yes. So what really breaks my heart is that there's so much, and there's been so much silence around sibling sexual abuse, and so many adults who experience this have never told anyone, or if they
Yeah,
did, they never received a helpful response. And that's traumatic for them. And it also means that the sibling who harmed them never received help.
right.
And you're absolutely right. Um, Research is really clear that juveniles with sexual behavior problems are an extremely different population from adult sex offenders. It's not pedophilia. You
Mm-mm.
mentioned some of the factors: impulse control, social cues. Um, and so when children and adolescents with sexual behavior problems receive evidence based treatment, their chance of going on to harm children in the future is extremely low.
Mm.
And so, what breaks my heart is that so many of these situations don't come to light when they're still children, and they could still really benefit from early intervention and treatment.
Yeah. Uh, so Tanya, I was preparing for preparing for this interview, and it, I am so appreciative of your work, and obviously the center is located within the Crimes Against Children Research Center at the University of New Hampshire that has for years been doing such amazing research on these topics. But I wasn't necessarily excited to be talking to you about. I was excited to talk to you, Tanya, because you're great and you've done such wonderful work in this field. But this is such a hard topic. So I first of all, I just want to thank you for making this part of your vocation, to look at this really difficult topic that's really harming kids, and so thank you for doing that, because I have to imagine it gets dark in those offices sometimes as you're going through the data, as you're looking at the interview transcripts, as you're, you know, talking to or interviewing or learning about victims.
Well, that's very kind, and you're welcome. I feel my job is easy compared to being a frontline responder or a
Mm.
clinician because um, that I can imagine. Well, we all, we all compare ourselves to others, but I will, something that I'd love to mention is if it's okay for me to bring
Yeah.
something else up, you know, going back to what parents and teachers can do, I'd love to see awareness lead to more prevention
Mm.
so that we can actually decrease the chance of this even happening because obviously we want to improve response and intervention, but if we could um, get this on people's radar and just have encouraging, healthy family practices around bodies and sexuality be sort of part of parenting and also,
Mm.
you know, talking to children about not just stranger danger,
Mm-hmm.
but also, the fact that someone who's close to them or that they know might try to do something that's not appropriate and making sure that they know, the terms for their body parts and the types of, behaviors that are okay between siblings and not okay between siblings. I think having those conversations explicitly with children is really important. And doing more of that prevention work is also what makes my job easier because I feel like it would be great if we could reduce the rates of sibling sexual abuse even happening, in addition to improving responses when it does happen.
Thank you so much for adding that. And um, let me ask you this, and because in school board meetings across the United States, there is this there's a fallacy that is being spread, and the fallacy is that if you educate children about something, they are more likely to do it. So this is a fallacy that is being talked about, has been talked about for a long time around sex education. We know that's not true. It's been talked about when we talk about harm reduction around substance use. Again, we know it's not true. But do you have any worries? There's any data at all that you can share that talking to children in the way that you just mentioned will in any way increase the likelihood of those children engaging in sibling sexual abuse?
I certainly don't think so. I think um I mean children should children need this information to actually navigate safety, but they also need to not be made responsible for it. So it's
Mm.
never the child's fault if they're sexually abused, right? And we shouldn't also say to them, don't let someone touch you there, because sometimes in the moment and in the context of the power dynamics of a situation, like a child is not going to be able to say, don't touch me there. So they need to be okay. The parents need to be people that the child can approach and tell and not be afraid that they're going to get in trouble or be judged. And then, just so you may or may not know this, but sibling sex is actually a very popular category in online porn, sibling
Mm.
and step sibling sex. And unfortunately, children, adolescents are seeing porn. m- I'm sure you've talked about this on your show, more than ever before. So this is if if educators or parents talk to kids about being safe around other children, including classmates,
including siblings, including older and younger children, if they talk to them about that, like it won't be the first time that they've heard about sibling sex.
Right.
It'll just be they're not hearing about it from porn, right?
Hmm.
It's kind of like, the argument that you don't want porn to be the only source of adolescents sex ed, right?
Right. Well, again, Tanya, thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for being a guest. I learned a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. Our whole initiative at SAARA is aimed at raising awareness and translating scientific evidence for parents, educators, healthcare providers. And so I was so appreciative to have the opportunity to come on your show. And I hope that, your listeners will consider following our social media, checking out our website. We have tons of resources for prevention and intervention. So thank you again.
That was Tanya Whitworth. Information about Tanya and links to resources from the Sibling Aggression and Abuse Research and Advocacy Initiative are at talkingaboutkids.com. And when you do visit talkingaboutkids.com, send me a note. Let me know what you think. I read every bit of feedback. The Talking About Kids theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.